Hello friends, welcome to my channel Techie. It gives me a lot of pleasure if you like, comment and share my videos. I would like to request you to subscribe my channel if you have not done it. And a heartfelt thanks for all my subscribers. Get started with Entity Framework Core in an ASP.NET MVC web app video tutorial. In this tutorial, we will learn about create a new ASP.NET Core MVC web app, set up the site style, learn about EF Core NuGet packages, create the data model, create the database context, register the school context, initial DB with the test data, create controller and views, view the database. From the File menu, select New Project. From the left panel, select Install Visual C# Web. Select ASP.NET Core Web Application. Enter Open University as a name and click OK. Wait for the new ASP.NET Core Web Application dialog to appear. Select Web Application Model View Controller Template. Make sure authentication is set to No Authentication. Click OK. A few simple changes will set up the site menu, layout and homepage. Open Views folder, Shared folder and select underscore layout.cs HTML file and make the following changes. Update the div class with a new class to show the menu list item properly. Same way, apply the class for UL and LI elements. Add menu entries for students, courses, instructors, and departments. Open Views folder, Home folder, and select index.cs HTML file and replace the following content. Press Ctrl F5 to run the project or choose Debug Start without debugging from the menu. You see the home page with the tabs for the pages you'll create in this tutorial. Please verify that the reference for the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.app package is available and its dependencies like Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server, Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Relational. In the models folder, create a class file named student.cs and replace the template code with the following code. The ID property will become the primary key column of the database table that corresponds to this class. By default, the entity framework interprets a property that is named ID or class name ID as the primary key. The enrollments property is a navigation property. Navigation properties hold other entities that are related to this entity. In this case, the enrollments property of a student entity will hold all the enrollment entities that are related to the student entity. In other words, if a given student row in the database has two related enrollment rows, rows that contain the student's primary key value in their student ID foreign key column, that student entity's enrollments navigation property will contain those two enrollment entities. In the models folder, create enrollment.cs and replace the existing code with the following code. The enrollment ID property will be the primary key. This entity uses the class name ID pattern instead of ID by itself as you saw in the student entity. Ordinarily, you would choose one pattern and use it throughout your data model. Here, the variation illustrates that you can use either pattern. The grade property is an enum. The question mark after grade type declaration indicates that the grade property is nullable. A grade that is null is different from a zero grade. Null means a grade is not known or has not been assigned yet. The student ID property is a foreign key and corresponding navigation property is a student. The course ID property is a foreign key and the corresponding navigation property is course. In the models folder, create course.cs and replace the following code. The enrollments property is a navigation property. A course entity can be related to any number of enrollment entities. The database generated attribute with the none parameter on the course ID property specifies that primary key values are provided by the user rather than generated by the database. In the project folder, create a folder named data. In the data folder, create a new class file named SchoolContext.cs and replace the template with the following code. The main class that coordinates entity framework functionality for a given data model is the database context class. You create this class by deriving from the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.db context class. In your code, you specify which entities are included in the data model. You can also customize certain entity framework behavior. This code creates a DB set property for each entity set. In entity framework terminology, an entity set typically corresponds to a database table and an entity corresponds to a row in the table. You could have omitted the dbset enrollment and dbset course statements and it would work the same. The entity framework would include them implicitly because the student entity references the enrollment entity and the enrollment entity references the course entity. When the database is created, Entity Framework creates tables that have names the same as the DB set property names. Property names for collections are typically plural, students rather than student, but developers disagree about whether table names should be pluralized or not. For these tutorials, you will override the default behavior by specifying singular table names in the DB context. To do that, we add the code in onModelCreating event. ASP.NET Core implements dependency injection by default. Services such as the Entity Framework Database context are registered with dependency injection during application startup. Components that require these services, such as MVC controllers, are provided these services via constructor parameters. To register SchoolContext as a service, open startup.cs file and add the code in the configured services method. The name of the connection string is passed into the context by calling a method on a DB context options builder object. For local development, the ASP.NET Core configuration system reads the connection string from the app settings.json file. Do not forget to add using statements for OpenUniversity.data and Microsoft.entity framework code namespaces, and then build the project. Open the app settings.json file and add a connection string as shown. In the data folder, create a new class file named dbinitializer.cs and replace the following code, which causes a database to be created when needed and loads test data into the new database. The entity framework will create an empty database for you. In this section, you write a method that is called after the database is created in order to populate it with test data. Here, you will use the ensure created method to automatically create the database. The code checks if there are any students in the database, and if not, it assumes the database is new and needs to be seeded with the test data. It loads test data into arrays rather than list collections to optimize performance. In program.cs, modify the main method to do the following on application startup. Get a database context instance from the dependency injection container. Call the seed method, passing it to the context. Dispose the context when the seed method is done. In older tutorials, you may see similar code in the configure method in startup.cs. Microsoft recommends that you use the configure method only to set up the request pipeline. Application startup code belongs in the main method. Now the first time you run the application, the database will be created and seeded with the test data. Whenever you change your data model, you can delete the database, update your seed method, and start afresh with a new database the same way. In later tutorials, we will show you how to modify the database when the data model changes without deleting and recreating it. Right-click the controllers folder in the Solution Explorer and select Add New Scaffolding item. In the Add Scaffold dialog box, select MVC controller with views using Entity Framework. Click Add. The Add MVC controller with views using Entity Framework dialog box appears. In the model class, select student. In data context class, select school context. Accept the default student's controller as the name. Click add. When you click add, the Visual Studio scaffolding engine creates a student's controller.cs file and set of views.cs HTML files that work with the controller. The scaffolding engine can also create the database context for you if you don't create it manually first, as you did earlier for this tutorial. You can specify a new context class in the add controller box by clicking the plus sign to the right of the data context class. Visual Studio will then create your DB context class as well as the controller and the views. You will notice that the controller takes a school context as a constructor parameter. ASP.NET Core dependency injection takes care of passing an instance of school context into the controller. You configured that in the startup.cs file earlier. The controller contains an index action method which displays all students in the database. The method gets a list of students from the students entity set by reading the students property of the database context instance. Press Ctrl F5 to run the project or choose Debug Start without debugging from the menu. Click the Students tab to see the test data that the DB initializer.initialize method inserted. Depending on how narrow your browser window is, you will see the Student tab link at the top of the page or you will have to click the navigation icon in the upper right corner to see the link. As we are not able to see the data, let's debug the code and fix the issue. Place the breakpoints at required places to debug and click on Debug Start Debugging. It will open the browser and once you get the control, it will execute the lines. Let's find out where we did the mistake. Okay, we got error here. Let's see what is the error. Okay, the date format is given wrong. Let's correct it and build it again and see it in the browser. We are able to see the data now successfully. When you started the application, the DB initializer.initialize method calls ensure created. Entity Framework saw that there was no database and so it created one. Then the remainder of the initialize method code populated the database with data. You can use SQL Server Object Explorer to view the database in Visual Studio. Right-click the student table and click View Data to see the columns that were created and the rows that were inserted into the table. Because you are calling ensure created in the initializer method that runs on app start, you could now make a change to the student class, delete the database, run the application again, and the database would automatically be recreated to match your change. The amount of code you had to write in order for the entity framework to be able to create a complete database for you is minimal because of the use of conventions or assumptions that the entity framework makes. The names of DBset properties are used as table names. For entities not referenced by DBset property, entity class names are used as table names. Asynchronous programming is the default mode for ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core. A web server has a limited number of threads available, and in high load situations, all of the available threads might be in use. When that happens, the server can't process new requests until the threads are freed up. With the synchronous code, many threads may be tied up while they are not actually doing any work because they are waiting for the input or output to complete. With asynchronous code, when a process is waiting for the input-output to complete, its thread is freed up for the server to use for processing other requests. As a result, asynchronous code enables server resources to be used more efficiently and the server is enabled to handle more traffic without delays. In this tutorial, we learned created a new ASP.NET Core MVC web app, set up the site style, learned about Entity Framework Core NuGet packages, created the data model, created the database context, registered the school context, initialized DB with test data, created controllers and views, viewed the database. Please subscribe for more videos. Thank you.